This is your Richie Allen radio show. Let's hear from a woman called Fionnuala ní Aoláin. Fionnuala ní Aoláin. She's a Galway woman, an Irish woman, and a lawyer and a lecturer in the United States of America. Went to Queen's University in Belfast, and she now works as a special rapporteur for the United Nations. And why am I bringing her up? Well, she did a brilliant interview on Dermot Murnaghan's programme on Sky News last night. Here, says Fionnuala ní Aoláin, here she says there is a second epidemic running alongside coronavirus. What could the second epidemic be running alongside coronavirus?
But the second epidemic, parallel to the first, is the epidemic of exceptional powers that are being used nefariously and not in violation in many cases of states' international law obligations, where states are using the coronavirus to do that which they could not do otherwise. And that is worrying in Hungary, but it's worrying in a number of countries around the world. Hungary is unfortunately not an exception.
Hungary is not an exception, she said. So what about elsewhere then? What about elsewhere? Where else are governments taking liberties with the coronavirus? Fionnuala ní Aoláin.
We've seen them in Europe. We see them in Latin America. We see there isn't a single region which is immune. And they're characterized by a number of things. An overuse of executive powers, a use of measures that are not really designed to address the issues of the health crisis, which is real, but go far beyond that. The abrogation of parliaments, the stripping of capacity of courts to review the kinds of measures that are taken, and increasingly encroachments on free speech under the guise of calling out fake news. But the news we have to be really concerned about is not just fake news about the epidemic, but fake news by governments about what they are doing to respond to the epidemic. And we could say that in part one of the reasons we have a global epidemic is we had a singular government which was unwilling or unable to share the information that it had available to it with the rest of the world.
Well, you mentioned Europe. We have, of course, been talking about Hungary, but are there other of the mature Western democracies that you feel are heading in this direction? And can I ask about the one I'm in, that likes to term itself as one of the oldest of them all, the United Kingdom? And, of course, you'll be aware that we've had a former Supreme Court judge in this country saying that the powers that the government now has, with the acceptance, indeed, beyond the acquiescence of the public demand for it, this is how despotism starts, Lord Sumption said.
Yes, good question or good statement, Dermot Murnaghan. Fionnuala is concerned by what's happening in the UK.
I will say it concerns an office like mine when we see a government producing a piece of legislation that's hundreds of pages long in the moment of emergency. When we see that, it makes us wonder whether or not, in fact, those powers were sitting in a drawer somewhere waiting to be used, or have powers that have been on a wish list for some time. It's clear governments can use emergency powers in times of crisis, but those measures have to be finely tailored. They have to be short term. They have to come with sunset clauses, and they have to come with robust oversight, because the danger is that if we overreach in these times of crisis, that we're going to wake up the morning after the pandemic and we're going to find ourselves in weaker democracies, less open societies, with the triumph of authoritarianism in many parts of the world. And we may then have survived a health crisis, but we will find ourselves in a different kind of crisis, which is a rule of law crisis.
Very good. And you might have noted the first part of that answer. If you didn't note it, if it didn't grab you, listen to what she says again.
I will say it concerns an office like mine when we see a government producing a piece of legislation that's hundreds of pages long in the moment of emergency.
Yes. It concerns my office, she says. This is a woman of the law. Clever woman. Like the cut of her jib, she says, concerns our office when a government, in this case the UK government, has legislation running hundreds of pages long, ready the instant there's an emergency. Makes us wonder if they haven't had it stored away for a rainy day.
Legislation that's hundreds of pages long in the moment of emergency. When we see that, it makes us wonder whether or not, in fact, those powers were sitting in a drawer somewhere waiting to be used, or have powers that have been on a wish list for some time.
On a wish list, yes. I think she's there, don't you? Murnaghan brings up technology then, and smart apps and smartphones, and this is good too.
I mean, and technology comes into this as well, doesn't it? Because, China is where coronavirus started, but also the Chinese methods for dealing with this, they were already part of the state apparatus. We're talking face recognition, surveillance of its citizens on a grand scale. Many Western nations are now looking at that and say, well, look how effectively they were able to deal with coronavirus, and talk here of things like apps being downloaded onto people's smartphones, them being able to be tracked. I mean, it could become compulsory then, more or less, couldn't it, to carry a smartphone and have one of these apps, more or less a digital version of an ID card?
Well, one of the challenges is when people are profoundly afraid, as many people are right now, when the threats to the right to life, which is the most fundamental of rights for people, is challenged, we're often willing to give away things that we would never think of giving away in ordinary circumstances. And some of those things include our basic freedoms, our freedom to move, our freedom to express ourselves, our freedoms to hold our most intimate health information securely and privately to ourselves. And of course, you're right, we have this extraordinary surveillance capacity, much of which has been used, for example, in security or counterterrorism contexts. And many of those security experts are now saying, we can repurpose this information, we can repurpose these systems to work for governments in the context of this crisis. But I would say we need to be really careful what we wish for in those circumstances. When we use or repurpose those kinds of technologies in that way, the clock doesn't always go back. In fact, more likely than not, the experience of emergency powers, if we look post 9/11, whether it's surveillance powers or the increasing use of biometric data, is that these powers entrench and they normalize, and the scope of our ordinary freedoms move so quickly away from us that we haven't even recognized that they're gone.
Here's a very bright, exceptionally bright woman, skeptical about how quick the new legislation, running hundreds of pages long, is suddenly ready. And a brain as bright and as alert as that must make the connection and must question the crisis itself, the genesis of the crisis. You've got to do that. Who benefits? She makes excellent points there about how the security and the intelligence agencies are now saying, we've developed all this technology for counter-terrorism. Let's now redistribute that technology and use it to help deal with the virus. In other words, let's turn what is already a surveillance state into something that was previously unimaginable. Let's give ourselves the power to follow not people whom we suspect, but let's start following every man, woman and child from the cock crowing, okay, until they go to bed at night. She's brilliant, but surely the point must come when a lady like that, with that size of a brain, has to say, well, I wonder, they got the legislation there, it's all ready to go. Maybe, just maybe, some of the people involved maybe had something to do with the crisis to begin with.